What's good, everybody? I'm Jendrik, and today I want to talk to you about how I view Modern in September 2021. Alright, so I decided to start making monthly tier list videos on the first Friday of each month to provide you with some context on how I view Modern at any given point of the time. Because the tier lists videos or tier lists in general are very popular, and everybody seem to have their own understanding of how different tiers works, and because there is no unified definition of, for example, what tier 2 means, and that's part of why I really dislike the system, is to come up with the definitions for different tiers, for explanations of different tiers that I will be using consistently in my videos. So then you have some reference points about if I talk about S tier decks, for example, in September, then you can directly translate your knowledge of what I mean by S tier to I don't know, December video or January video or whatever. I will make a short introduction to tiers in every video, so you don't have to go back to this one and watch it every single time. So don't worry about it. Okay, so as far as tier goes, let's start with the one that's right on top, and also the one that won't really show up that much. And that's Z. You heard it correctly. Z, the last letter of the alphabet, which is a tier that I reserved for some absolutely and utterly broken tier 0 stuff like Eldrazi or Hogak. So unless we have some modern apocalypse, this tier won't be presented in most of those lists because it's reserved for this completely busted stuff. Next up, we have S tier. S tier will be the best deck or decks that are constantly on top of the metagame despite being a known factor for the prolonged amount of time. And here are we getting to what do I take into account when I'm talking about different tiers? Because some people like to say that tier system is the function of popularity of different decks, and some people say that they are that tier system is function of power of those decks, and some people like to mix it up. And for me, I primarily focus on the power, but I also take the popularity in account. So even if I think that the deck is really good, if it's not very popular, I won't put it into S tier. I will comfortably put it into A tier, but I won't put it into S tier because for me, S tier are decks that withstand the test of time and the scrutiny of the format while being in the spotlight. So, for example, if we have Modern Horizons 3 or another completely shaking addition to the format that will change everything, it's very likely that I won't have any S tier decks in the first month because, for me, as I've said before, S tier decks have to hold under the scrutiny of the format and prove themselves over the prolonged amount of time. Then we have A tier, and A tier is the bulk of the competitive metagame. I wouldn't fault you for playing any of those decks in any large event. Of course, if you are playing like a very small invitation only event, then all those metagame dynamics are getting kind of weird. But for the most part, if you are playing in a challenge, PTQ, GP, regional stuff, or a big paper event in your country, I wouldn't fault you for playing any of those decks. Those decks are usually both powerful and resilient, unlike some decks from the lower tiers. Then we have a B tier that's usually And here where the system that I'm using, which I think is pretty good, deviates from the other decks, from the other systems, because for me, B tier is not tier 2 decks. B tier is exploits. So most of the time, on most weekends, those decks will be Bs at best, but on a rare occasion, those decks will be S tier decks. And that's the precise time to play them. Those are decks that are metagame exploits, that are, for the most part, lacking the inherent power of S and Ace, or S's and Ace, but from time to time, those are precisely the best thing to do on any given weekend. Then we have C tier, which is okay stuff, and those are either worse versions of S and A tier stuff, or decks that don't have the same kind of power as the higher tiered stuff. Because it's the second to last tier on my list, it might seem that I think those decks are bad or terrible, but that's not always the case. Because I reserve B tier for exploits, the C tier decks are what most people commonly refer to as tier 2 decks. Most of them are decent decks that have a chance to win any given tournament, even though some of them are, in my eyes, inferior versions of other decks. And I want to focus on this inferior version point, because, for example, a bit of spoiler, I have the red black Lurus deck in the C tier deck, in the C tier. Even though it plays a bunch of very good cards, you can even say broken cards, and it's not a bad deck, of course, but for me, it's an inferior version of both Jund and Grixis. So it can't really make A tier, in my opinion. And then B tier is reserved for exploits. So don't think of this system as a like the lateral system when the S tier is here, A, B, C, D, because like you have S's that are like, if you have a diagram, S's are probably similar to on power to A's, but they are more popular and they are more stable on the top of the metagame. So like it's S's, then A's are here, then B's are like somewhere in there, outside of the camera even, because those are very very specific type of decks for specific situations most of the time. Also decks that, like, you will see B tier decks every single week, but from time to time those will be, or most of the time those decks will be worse than A tiers, as I said, and from time to time those will be better. And then you have C tier decks that are like, C tier is pretty directly below A, like you have A, C, and then B is like here. So it's most of the time it's those decks, B and C tier, are pretty similar on power level, but B has the potential of being an exploit. So B tier decks, to put it very, very simply, sorry, it's very convoluted, or quite convoluted, but I really wanted this system to make sense to me. So B tier decks are C tier decks that has the potential to be a good exploit and be better than C tier. And then D tier is basically everything else. Sometimes I'll think about some decks to put in there. For example, this month I have, I think, 2 decks. But if you don't see a deck on the list, it's most likely in this tier. So, for example, I don't know. I don't have Merfolk on my tier list. Merfolk is D. I don't have Elves. Elves is D. I don't have Banned Stoneblade. It's D as well. So if you don't see anything, then if you don't see a deck on the tier list, it's down there. So yeah, basically, to sum it up, TLDR of the tier system that I will bookmark on YouTube to be a separate short part if you ever want to go back to this. Let's roll. Z, complete broken stuff that most of the time won't be on the list. S, best, most popular decks. A, strong decks that are the bulk of competitive metagame. B, decks that are weaker than Ace, but with potential to exploit metagame on a right weekend. C, basically similar to B decks, but without this potential, so there are weaker decks than A decks, in my opinion. And then D tier, everything else. So with that in mind, I hope that at least this TLDR version of it sheds some light on what I was trying to convey. Let's jump right onto the tier list itself. All right. So, as I've said before, no Z tier decks for now, and hopefully we won't have Z tier decks for many months or years, or preferably ever. So let's start with the S tier. In S tier, I have only one deck, which is Blue-Red Merktide. So, as I've said before, I don't think that Merktide is head and shoulders above any of the A tier decks. I don't even think it's like clearly better than those decks. I put Merktide into S tier because it's been a known quantity for almost 2 months at this point, something like that, and yet it's still on the top of the metagame every weekend. If not in both challenges, at least in one challenge, you see a bunch of Merktide decks. For example, for quite some time, Hammer was on like the best deck by in the eyes of many people, but it waxed and waned, and if people are hating for Hammer, then Hammer won't be on the top, and it's very hard to hate out Merktide. You basically need to have a structurally good matchup to be favored against Merktide. There is not a hate card for Merktide. There's a strategy that you can use to beat Merktide from time to time. But it's still like the deck has so cosmically low fail rate because it's 2 colors, so it has mana problems very rarely. It doesn't take much damage from its mana base. It has cheap and efficient cards, so it plays well on low land counts because the spells are cheap. It can't really flood that well or that easily because it has Canopy Lens and Fire Islet. It has Darcy triggers. It has Expressive Iteration. It has a bunch of manipulations, so it's and also it can use the mana quite well because of Expressive Iteration. So it's good on low land counts, okay on like higher land counts. Just all around a very strong deck that I think if you have no prior attachments to any strategy in Modern, or if you don't have attachments to any kind of strategy, I think if you're starting out in Modern, I would just recommend playing Merktide and see if that's your gem. If it is, that's great, because you will have on your hands probably the best, or if not the best, one of the best decks at any given point for the foreseeable future. And if not, you can look on the A tier. That's I'm gonna what is called transition to right now. So in my A tier, I have 5 decks this month. First of all, two Lurus decks. I have the Grixis deck that I've been playing for quite some time, and the Jant Saga deck. Then I have Hammer, so I guess 3 Lurus decks, and 2 of the strongest Cascade decks, so Rhinos and Living End. As far as the Jant Saga deck, it's still a fairly new deck, so I only see it in action a limited amount of times. I've played against it, I think, twice or 3 times maybe. So I don't have that much experience in the matchup yet, but it's definitely a very strong contender. It works on a similar, basically all of those Ragavan and then either Iteration or Ren Saga decks have the very similar and strong principle of being a good low land count decks because of Ragavan and Darcy and stuff like this, and also with a pretty good late game thanks to Ren Saga or Iteration. Then there's the Grixis deck, and you can say that I'm biased, but I don't think that's the case. I didn't put Grixis in S tier or anything because it's not very popular. And why it's not very popular? It might sound kind of delusional. I don't think it is, but it might. I haven't played any challenges in over a month, I think now, because we have lifted some restrictions from pandemic in Poland right now, so I get to see my friends and go out and enjoy my time with them. And it's pretty likely that we will have another lockdown in like October. So for now, I just want to skip the weekend challenges and go out, enjoy IRL stuff for as long as I can. And I'm gonna be back to playing more challenges once another lockdown hit, most likely. So I haven't played in a non-league tournament on Modo in quite a while. And I think if somebody who's somewhat recognizable on Modo gets a good result on a weekend, people will just flock and play this deck. And then it will stay that way until somebody else achieves a good result with another deck, if they are recognizable, and people will play this deck. So, for example, when I top 4 the PTQ with Grixis, I was seeing a lot of Grixis decks in the next I don't know week or two. I top 16 the challenge or the showcase challenge week after, still a bunch of Grixis, and then I stopped playing those tournaments. People were kind of getting lower on Grixis, and people were just starting to play different decks because, for example, the Jan Saga deck won a challenge and people want to try this out, or Murktide had another good weekend and people want to try Murktide. But I am convinced that Grixis is a very, very strong deck. I've played a paper tournament last week, or 2 paper tournaments. On Saturday we had 100 players, on Sunday 160, and I split the finals on Saturday and top 4 on Sunday. And of course, there definitely was a skill or at least experience gap between me and most of my competitors. But there was a bunch of strong modern grinders from Modo there. Sodek was there, Laplacian was there, Canister was there, so a bunch of people who can play Magic really well. And also one of my patron, Łukasz, Łukasz made the finals in the larger event on Sunday with my with the same 75. So it's not like I just won as much as I did because I could have won the same amount of different decks. I just think that Grixis is really, really good. I think you are bit favored against Murktide. It's still a pretty close match. I'd rather be on Grixis side, but it's still like within the 55%, definitely. Within the 55%, even like probably 33 or 30 or 53 or 52, but not important in this video. Grixis is, in my opinion, tier 1 or A tier as well as Jant. Then we have Hammer. By now you know why Hammer is strong. Fast kills, fairly good at grinding with Paladin and Lurus and Ingenious Smith. Nice hate cards in Sanctifier on Vec. 1 color mana base, so you can't really lose to your own mana all that often. That's overall a very strong deck. And then we have Cascade decks in Rhinos and Living End. I don't know if I think that Rhinos are stronger than Living End or the other way around. I think both are strong, but different decks. Like, it's kind of weird for me to compare Rhinos to Living End because they are both Cascade decks. And it's like saying that you want to compare Lurus or Grixis Lurus to Hammer because they are both Lurus decks. Since I think Rhinos are more of a Delver midrange deck or a tempo deck that tries to put 8 or 10 power on the board and then use tools like Force of Negation or Fire Ice to stop disrupt their opponent. Not forever, but for 2 turns or 1 turn that will be enough for them to connect with their rhinos and just finish the game. While Living End is just a combo deck that cycles their dudes, that doesn't do much or that don't do much without the Living End ever resolving. So those decks are different, I think, by a pretty wide margin, but they're both very powerful. And once again, if you want to play combo-y or like if you want to play a combo deck that, or a like mid-range deck that has those nut draws and can really exploit and abuse those free spells, because I think it's all about free spells. Rhinos are really good at leveraging tempo with free spells. So is Living End. The outburst force of negation on the end of the turn of your opponent is a very, very strong pattern, especially if you have another Shroudless Agent on your turn. It's almost unbeatable for like counter magic and this type of interaction. So Grief in the Living End deck is so good at interacting, playing through hate. I'm not here to talk to you about why those decks are so strong. Like I am, but I don't have to explain everything about those decks because obviously I will sit there or here for an hour or so. So let's just stop here and let's say that A tier once again is Grixis Lurus, Giant Lurus with Saga, Hammer, Rhinos, and Living End. Let's jump onto the B tier, which are once again exploits. And those exploits are, right now, in my opinion, Elementals, Mill, Burn, Tron, and Blue-White. So Elementals first became really popular when Hammer was very, very popular, because Elementals are really good into Hammer. Both Solitude and Fury are insane at dealing with their stuff. They have Force of Vigor out of the sideboard, they have Teferi Time Raveler, they have Endings, they have Risen Reef to outgrind, so Elementals are just really, really good into Hammer. But I don't think they are as strong as A-tier decks in general, because they are pretty prone to flooding and to having bad disjointed draws. When I first started playing against Elementals, I was really scared because in my first 2 or 3 matches, I just got hit by only good draws out of them when their deck looks really good. But then when I started playing and watching, for example, Canister plays it more often, some of their draws just doesn't do anything. Like you draw 2 pitch spells without Risen Reef to recur your card advantage. Or you have non-Utopia Sprawl hand with like Omnath that start doing things on turn 4. So I don't think that Elementals is as inherently strong as the A-tier decks, but in the right metagame, I think it can be really, really strong. Then we have Mill, which is a similar story. If the field is heavy on combo, big mana, and control decks, for example, if Blue-White, that I will talk about briefly in a second, is good, and if Tron is good, then Mill is a good deck to exploit those decks. So it's basically, it's good at exploiting exploits, or some of the exploits. So it's kind of hard, I think, to navigate to pick a good weekend with Mill, because you have to know that it's a good weekend to play Tron and Blue-White, basically, I would say. But yeah, I think Mill is another one of those decks. Then we have Burn, which is, once again, if people are not playing that much Hammer, and if you can play a lot of Roiling Vortex against Cascade decks, I think Burn is pretty good into Tron. I think it's pretty good into Blue-White. It's pretty good into Cascade decks if you have Vortexes. It's pretty good against Grixis. I think the matchup is quite close, but it's definitely not like a matchup you don't want to see if you are a Burn player. So if the field is not all Hammer, and Murktide is probably pretty bad for Burn as well, then go for it. Next up, Tron. I think Tron is the biggest punish for the red-black X Lurus decks. Like Grixis, both Grixis and I think Giant are bad against Tron. I know that Grixis is from what I played, and you have a fighting chance. Especially right now I'm playing 2 spreading seas for like sagas and stuff in the main deck. So if you go Ragavan in 2 spreading seas, usually you can, from time to time, you can buy enough time to finish them off game 1. And things obviously get better after sideboard with like Alpine Moons and counter spells. But it's a very tough matchup game 1, and I assume it's similar for Giant Saga. I think Saga decks have Expedition Map and Ghost Quarter in the main deck, so if you're on the play and you know you're playing against Tron and you go turn 1 Saga, turn 3 sacrifice Saga or float sacrifice, get map, crack map for Ghost Quarter, then maybe you can disrupt them with Renin 6 fast enough, but I don't think, I guess if you have turn 1 Ragavan, you can't have turn 1 Ragavan with Saga. Maybe turn 1 Saga, turn 2 Ragavan, something like this. But yeah, it doesn't look very good game 1 for Giant Saga as well, especially since Tron decks can quite easily play up to 4 relics in the main deck, which is like completely insane against like Darcy and Collagen's Command and Lurus decks and Rensky. So yeah, Tron is really good into those red black X Lurus decks in my opinion. And then finally we have blue white and B tier, which I think right now if you want to play this kind of traditional, let's say, control deck with like sweepers and planeswalkers, I think you have to go more into the stacks direction. I think you want to focus on Chalice of the Void. I think you want to just start with 4 and maybe trim some, but I would start with 4 copies. For me, the backbone of this deck are 4 Chalices, 4 Endings, 4 Solitudes, 4 Teferi Time Ravelers, and then some amount of Supreme Verdicts, probably like 2 or 3. And then from this core, you can build the rest of it, some Archmage's Charms, some Shark Typhoons, some, I don't know, Teferi, Hero of the Minari, whatever you have. But you have to be more of a stacks deck. Maybe you want to play main deck Rest in Peace, if that's the right call for the metagame. You basically want to be more of a permanent-based prison-ish deck than a Drogo control deck, because it won't work. Because Drogo is not very good if you have a counter spell and your opponent can play 2 cards on 1 turn because all of their cards are so mana efficient. Then we have a C tier. In C tier, I have, first of all, Grief Ephemerate piles. Then I have Red Black Lurus, Indomitable Creativity, Glimpse of Tomorrow, Amulet, and Blue Red Prowess. So let's talk about Red Black Lurus, Glimpse, and Prowess first, because I think those 3 have a pretty similar quality in being the worst versions of S and A tier decks. So I think Red Black Lurus is largely an inferior version of Grixis and Giant Lurus decks, because okay, you have a bit better mana base, but it's not like those decks' mana bases are bad. They are okay. And you can play like Den of the Backbear that Aspiring Spike has been playing. Sure, you have a manland. You might have like Shizu or Shinka right there. Sure, but it's still not nearly as powerful as Expressive Iteration or Rensky with Saga. Like, you just don't have this type of power card. You will argue that you can play Dotty Voidwalker. Well, you can play Dotty Voidwalker in Grixis and Jant if you want as well. You can skew your mana towards it, and it's not that hard to do so. It's probably not very easy to play both, for example, both Voidwalker and Counterspell in Grixis, but you can pick and choose. So I just don't think that skewing both Iteration and Saga for the sake of like more consistency, even though those decks are actually pretty consistent already, is a good idea. It's one of those decks that I talked about earlier that I think are okay, but from my perspective as a competitive player, I just don't want to play the worst version of other decks, and I feel like that's the case here, so that's why Grixis Lurus or Red Black Lurus is in C tier. Then Glimpse is the worst Cascade deck of all 3. It still has pretty powerful draws. I'm talking about the Omnath Season Pyromancer Tireless Provisioner version of Glimpse, not the Eldrazi Lotto version of the deck. So Yeah, I think it still can do powerful things, can play fairly okay-ish mid-range game, but for the most part, I think it's a bit better than living and at playing a game in which you don't resolve glimpse, sure, but you won't win many of those games, and your finish is, I think, less uh, less impressive than living end's finish and can be stopped by many different things. So I do think that glimpse is just worse than those decks. It's not a surprise for anyone, I think. So that's why glimpse is here. But I still think it's popular, that it's powerful or somewhat powerful, so it's not in the D tier. I don't think it deserves to be in the D tier. And Blue Red Prowess, I think it's for the most part a similar deck to either Burn, which is an exploit deck at least, or a Murktide when you are playing like Darcy and cheap creatures and bubbles and stuff like this. But you can't really beat Murktide Regent as a creature, and you are just playing a similar strategy to those decks, but you don't have this insanely powerful finisher in Murktide. So other C tier decks that I already listed before, Creativity. I do think that the mana base of Creativity is what stops it from being a better deck. I think it's strong, but I think it's losing to itself a bit too often for my liking to put it into A tier. Amulet is just fairly underpowered. I was considering putting Amulet into D tier, but because the Asmo decks are less popular and Primeval Titan will live a bit often than it used to live like a month ago, I decided to put it in the C tier. The Grief Ephemerate piles have the traditional problems of black-white midrange decks. When you can't Thoughtseize the top of your opponent's deck, you are either soft to creature removal if you are playing Stoneforge, to Grave Hate if you are playing removal spell, Reanimator package, to Artifact if you are playing Hate if you are playing Stoneforge. They can have very good starts, and they are fairly stable and consistent because they are two colors, but still I don't think they are as strong as those A tier decks, mostly because they are not playing any broken cards. They are not playing Ragavan, Lurus, Saga, those type of broken things that you can play in the stronger decks. And then that's it for C tier, and in the D tier, as I've said numerous times before, is basically everything. In this month, I singled out Hardened Scales and Bring to Light Scape Shift because I started making the icons for the tier list. So I just went to Goldfish, and if I had decks that I thought are worthy of being on a tier list, I just started making icons for those, or the tiles to move on the tier list. And after I was said and done with everything, I decided that Hardened Scales and Shift are worse than the other decks, so I put them into D tier. But once again, sorry for repeating myself for the fourth or fifth time probably, but you can imagine Merfolk and like Bandblade and Elves and Eldrazi-tron and Mono-Blue-tron and every other deck that I didn't mention right in there with all those decks, with Scales and BTL. All right. So I don't know how long this video is right now. I think about half an hour, but I don't really have a good sense of time while I'm recording them. I record them in separate like parts. Every time you see the video transition, I'm rolling everything from one video transition to the other one in one take. So I don't know how long this take is so far. Probably like 20 minutes. Sorry for all the ramblings that were kind of prolonging this stuff, but that's my first of those, and I think in like 2 or 3 videos of this type I will be better at doing it, and I will be more concise, and those will take like 20 minutes instead of half an hour. So regardless of that, thanks for watching this. I hope you enjoyed this type of content. I think it's a pretty interesting thing to be doing, so I liked doing it. And if you enjoyed it as well, please leave me a comment either on YouTube if you are watching it in the future when it's public on YouTube, or preferably in Discord if you're one of my Patreons and you want to give me feedback. It will be most appreciated. And as always, you will have links to all my socials and other content platforms in the description below. I am streaming on Twitch on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays from around 1 p.m. Central European. Sorry for that. Once again, links are in the description. My Patreon, my Twitter, stuff like this. So yeah, that's all for today. Thanks so much for watching. Have a lovely weekend, and as always, happy Ludusing.